Alright, so today we're going to go through and look at Chapter 5, which is the Integumentary System. And this is the system of the body coverings. So as we progress through today, the first thing we're going to talk about is the skin. And this is what most of us think about in terms of the integument. There are going to be three main regions in the skin. Again, looking at word roots, these become important here. The main thickness of the skin is what's called the dermis, and that's going to be the middle region. Above that, we have the epidermis. This prefix epi means on top of or above. We also have the hypodermis, which is below, hypo meaning below. So if we're looking from the outside in, we will see the epidermis, the dermis, and then the hypodermis. So here is a diagram of the things that we will be talking about today. And then here we have the region of the epidermis, and that region of the epidermis we will look at in depth. The epidermis is made of stratified squamous epithelium, so we're going to be taking a look at that. Here we have the dermis. Now within the dermis there's lots of stuff going on. We are going to see accessory structures that will have various functions, and we'll go through and talk about a few of these. And then finally the hypodermis. The hypodermis is also called the superficial fascia because that is above the layer of muscle. From the rat dissection, when you were skinning the rat and taking the skin off, after you separated the skin, you were actually separating the hypodermis from the muscle and the underlying fascia. So we're going to begin looking at the epidermis. So what we've done is we've basically focused in on that top region. So the epidermis is going to run from right about here all the way up. This is a region of stratified squamous epithelium. Now we say this is keratinized stratified squamous epithelium. And what that means is we're going to see that the cells here are producing a protein called keratin. And we're going to talk a little bit about why that is in a few minutes. Now some of the different cells that we will see here, we have our keratinocytes. These are going to be the cells that make keratin. We have what are called melanocytes, and melanocytes are going to make something called melanin. Then we have things called Merkel cells and Langerhans cells, and these each have their own distinct role. This very outer portion here, this is what you will feel as the surface of your skin. Now the different cells each have their own role. Please remember when you're talking about cells, the ending site or cyto has to do with cells. So the keratinocytes are producing keratin. Please notice the spelling, that is K-E-R-A-T-I-N. There's going to be another word I'll say later that sounds similar, but is spelled completely different and is a completely different thing. Keratin is a fibrous protein. So if you remember our discussion of proteins way back in Chapter 2, proteins that are fibrous have a very strong organization. They're not going to dissolve in water, and these are going to be structural. The other types of cells are going to be the melanocytes. These melanocytes are going to produce melanin. Melanin is important pigmentation, right? It is important chemical that actually is a pigment, and that's what's going to give skin an underlying brown color, and we'll look at some of the effects of that. Then we have these Langerhans cells. Now, even though this is a big kind of scary word, what these Langerhans cells are, these are a type of macrophage. The macrophage cells, these are cells that are phagocytic. Okay? These are cells that can do that cell eating, right, in which they can engulf things. So these are really your body's first line of defense in terms of if some sort of bacterial invasion occurs in the epidermis. Okay, so they're really part of the immune system. And you can see them over here. Right? They have these parts that spread out throughout the layers. The last of these cells we'll talk about is called a Merkel cell, and the Merkel cell is located here right at the border between the dermis and the epidermis, and these are going to function along with something called a free nerve ending as a type of touch receptor, and that's what allows you to have some sensation in this uppermost part. This is epithelial tissue. So when we think back to epithelial tissue from Chapter 4, epithelial tissue had 5 main characteristics, and this is going to have all of those. So those characteristics were polarity, right? The bottom layer looks different than the top layer. special contacts. So in this layer right here, we're going to see very clearly those special contacts, specifically desmosomes. We're going to see that this is avascular. Notice there's no blood supply, but it is innervated. So here we see those Merkel discs providing innervation. We are also going to see that it is highly regenerative, right? And we're going to talk about that in this bottom layer here. So just bear that in mind. This is epithelial tissue. So we're going to go through each of the different layers. The first layer is going to be called the stratum basale, or the basal layer. This is a layer where we have lots of mitosis occurring. This cell right here showing you these X's lined up in the middle, that's trying to show you that this cell is undergoing division, rapid mitotic division. So this is the layer that is constantly going to be regenerating these epithelial cells. You can sometimes, or you will sometimes see this called the stratum germinativum, right, as another way of saying the stratum basale. This is going to be firmly attached to the dermis, right? And that was that fifth and final characteristic of epithelial tissue. Epithelial tissue must always be sitting on connective tissue. So we'll see the dermis as connective tissue. The next layer up is called the stratum spinosum, right, or the prickly layer. The reason it's called the prickly layer, here the cells are going to contain a web-like interaction of intermediate filaments, or those desmosomes. So all of these cells in the stratum spinosum, you look at these little red dots on the diagram, that's showing you desmosomes. And if you remember, desmosomes are where you have cells that are connected so they're strong. What happens, the reason it's called the prickly layer, is when this is preserved and put on a slide and dehydrated, those cells shrink a little bit, but those connections stay, so the cells look like they have little spikes or spines coming out of them. Here we're going to see lots of melanin granules and Langerhans cells, and this is actually a fairly thick region here, the stratum spinosum. Then we have the stratum granulosum, or the granulated layer. This would be shown here. In this part, we have a relatively thin layer, maybe 3 to 5 cell layers thick. Here's where we're going to see those keratinocytes really, really drastically changing their appearance. So they're going to go from being relatively round, thick cells. They're going to start flattening out. They're also going to fill up with granules of keratohyalin. This is a form of keratin that is going to cause these cells to dry out. It's going to fill them up, basically. Now, not shown on this particular diagram, and only found in areas of thick skin. Thick skin would be like the soles of your feet. There's a layer called the stratum lucidum, right, which is the clear layer. And this would be a layer that is superficial or on top of the stratum granulosum, where you would have a fairly thin layer of clear cells, okay, where you have a row of flat, dead keratinocytes. The final layer, then, is this outer layer. This is the stratum corneum. Okay? This is the most dried out layer. This can be anywhere up to 3/4 of the thickness of the epidermis. This is going to allow for waterproofing. So this is what prevents water that sits on your skin from getting in your skin. It's also going to prevent water that's in your skin from leaking out. This is going to be what protects you from abrasion and penetration. This is also going to be a boundary. So this is going to protect your skin, protect your body from biological, chemical, or physical assaults. This is the layer that gets kind of dry and flaky, and if you go like this on your skin, you'll actually pull those cells off. We're constantly sloughing these off. Right? If you use a loofah in your shower in the morning, you're constantly taking those layers off. But that's okay, because we have this stratum basale that's dividing, so we're constantly renewing that. What you can imagine is the cells divide here and move up. So this cell here in the future will eventually be up in the stratum corneum. So that is the epidermis. You should be able to describe and name these different sublayers as well as the different types of cells that we see throughout. So just below the epidermis is where we're going to have the dermis. Now, the dermis is going to be the majority of the thickness of skin. It's made of strong but flexible connective tissue. Here we're going to see certain cell types that we would associate with connective tissue. So things like fibroblasts. Okay. If you remember, fibroblasts are what create our connective tissue proper. Because this is connective tissue proper, we're going to expect to see fibers, different fibers. We're also going to see, once again, those cells of immunity, things like macrophages, and even things called mast cells and white blood cells. And mast cells and white blood cells are also kind of like first responders of the immune system. Now, there are two layers within the dermis. You do not see the distinction between them as clearly, even under the microscope. Okay? So you have the papillary layer and the reticular layer. Now, the papillary layer, this would be right at the interface between the epidermis and the dermis. And what we have these little peg-like projections that stick up, and they create a way for the dermis to hold on to the epidermis. Those projections are called dermal papillae, hence this being called the papillary layer. Now, within the dermal papillae, we are going to see certain secondary structures. So we'll see capillary loops. Remember, epidermis has no blood supply, but it needs to get nutrients, it needs to get rid of wastes. That occurs through these capillary beds in the dermis. We're also going to see some what are called Meissner's corpuscles. And these Meissner's corpuscles, these are going to be touch receptors. We're also going to see what are called free nerve endings, and these free nerve endings, these are part of the nervous system, and they're going to interact with those Merkel cells that we saw previously. This is going to be mostly areolar connective tissue, right, with lots and lots of collagen and elastic fibers in it. Now, most of the thickness of the skin itself, and specifically of the dermis, is what's called the reticular layer. Here's where we're going to see that irregular, dense connective tissue, lots of collagen fibers. This is what's going to give strength and resiliency to the skin. If you think about our skin, every time you move, that skin is being pulled and pushed and twisted. It has to have a good degree of strength. It also has to have a good degree of elasticity, so that if you pinch your skin up, it can return, right? That would be the strength would come from collagen fibers, and that elasticity would come from elastin or elastic fibers. The last part is going to be this hypodermal region, or the hypodermis. The hypodermis is actually going to be mostly adipose tissue held together with some areolar connective tissue. It is deep or below the dermis. So now we need to talk about some of the secondary parts of the skin. We've seen the basic anatomy of it, so let's talk a little bit about the physiology and how it works. Our unique skin color is due to several things interacting. Okay? One of these is melanin. Melanin is produced by those cells called melanocytes. Melanin is a brown to black pigment. Okay? Depending on ethnicity, depending on genetics, it can even go to like the reddish brown, yellow brown colors. When we talk about somebody who's tanning, right, you go to the beach, you lay out, you get tan, you're seeing an upregulation in production of melanin, right, and that's making your skin more brown colored. Melanin is not only responsible for skin color, it's also responsible for your hair color. If any of you have freckles or pigmented moles, right, little dark spots, sunspots, beauty spots, whatever you call them, those are usually due to a local deposition of melanin, where you have lots of melanin. Now, the other thing that gives our skin its particular color is called carotene. Before I told you keratin with a K and carotene with a C, two very different things. If you say them quickly, they sound alike. Carotene has the word carrot in it. Right? This is actually a pigment that gives yellow to orange colors. Right? We see it most obvious in the palms of the hands, the soles of the feet. Okay? You may have, if you get online and Google, you may have heard of people who, go on these crazy diets and they eat nothing but carrots for 3 weeks and their skin takes on a very orange color. That is possible. Okay, that is possible. They don't actually turn orange. What you see then is you see that they're taking in too much of this carotene. Now, the third important thing that gives our skin its particular color is hemoglobin. Now, hemoglobin's job is not to give our skin color. Hemoglobin's job is to carry oxygen. It's what makes our blood either a purpley red or a bright red, depending on if it has oxygen or not. So it's actually the hemoglobin within the blood vessels of the face and skin. Right? So if you've ever seen somebody who's ill, who's very, very ill, right, maybe has anemia, they look very pale. Right? Even if they're normally a darker person, they have this underlying pallor. That's because perhaps they don't have enough hemoglobin. This is why when you get embarrassed, sometimes you get what's called, you blush. That's actually where you get more blood rushing to your face. It's a sign of stress. So what we see in terms of skin color is really, you could think about it, a layering of these different things. Okay? Everyone, with the exception of albinos, has melanin in some amount, more or less. Okay? Everyone has carotene and everyone has hemoglobin. So you can imagine you're layering the colors. So now let's get into some of those important secondary structures or accessory structures that we see within the skin. This is what's going to allow the skin to do some of its important jobs in terms of physiology. One of the important things we're going to see are different glands here. Now, these are going to be exocrine glands. These are going to be exocrine glands, so they are modified forms of epithelial tissue. We looked at some examples of this back in Chapter 4 when we looked at epithelial tissue. The four main kinds that we're going to mention are called eccrine sweat glands, apocrine sweat glands, ceruminous glands, and mammary glands. The other word that you might see for sweat glands in general are called sudiferous glands. The eccrine sweat glands, these are the sweat glands that you find throughout the body, but specifically concentrated on the forehead, soles of feet, the palms. This is when you start sweating, right? This is where you have lots and lots of sweat glands. Okay? Now, we have sweat glands distributed throughout the body. So the eccrine sweat glands, these are releasing the sweat that we think of as being regular sweat. Right? Now, there's a reason we sweat. Why do we sweat? It's cool down, right? It's your body's cool down system. Now, the other kind of sweat gland called apocrine sweat glands, these are actually very different. These are found in the axillary, the armpit region, and the anogenital region. Here, rather than producing just a regular sweat that is mostly water with some salts, maybe a little bit of some nitrogenous waste in it, we actually see a high concentration of lipids and proteins here. So basically, in the armpit region and in the anogenital region, the sweat that's created is different. That's kind of why your armpit sweat and your groin sweat is really, really stinky. As opposed to, like, if you're sweating and you sniff your arm, it doesn't really smell bad. Right? The other thing that has to do with that also has to do then with bacteria that grows, but we won't get into that. Now, this gland, the ceruminous gland, this is a modified type of apocrine gland. It's found in the external ear, so in your ear canal, and that's going to secrete something called cerumen, and another word for cerumen is earwax. Now, earwax, you might not think about earwax as really being important, but earwax is actually quite important. Earwax helps to coat the inside of the ear canal so that if water gets in your ear, it's supposed to come out of your ear. The earwax also helps prevent things from getting in your ears, like bugs. Now, most of us don't have a problem with bugs crawling in our ear, okay? But it can happen, right? Earwax is not a nice substance, right? Earwax has got a very kind of nasty smell to it and a nasty flavor to it. Okay? So it's actually repellent. Right? Now, the last kind, these are mammary glands. These are specialized sweat glands as well. They're only found within mammary tissue, which is usually only found in females and can be activated. And these are turned on by certain hormones. Okay? And what they produce is they produce milk. The other important gland are what are called sebaceous glands. And the sebaceous glands, these are going to be found, again, throughout the body. You find them often around the base of hairs. Sebaceous glands are going to produce an oily substance called sebum. These are also modified epithelial cells. Because this is producing an oil or a lipid, we're going to see that these will be released through holocrine release, holocrine secretion. These are more prevalent in areas where we have more hair, Okay, so you tend to have more sebaceous glands. That's why if you let your hair go 2 or 3 days, it may start to feel oily. Hair we had listed and we talked about as being one of the accessory structures of the integumentary system. What we see, these are actually filamentous strands of dead keratinized cells. These are going to then be derived from epidermal cells. So when we look at the hair and where the hair is formed, we're actually going to look at impocketings of the epidermis. Now this contains keratin. It's a different kind of keratin than we would see in the skin. Obviously our hair and our skin feel different. This is just a different form of keratin called hard keratin as opposed to what you have in your skin. It's called soft keratin. There are going to be 3 main parts or regions of the hair. We have the medulla, the cortex. Medulla is the innermost part, cortex is surrounding it, and then the outermost part is the cuticle. Hair has pigmentation, it has color. That is due to melanocytes. As we age, those melanocytes sometimes die off. And what we see then is changes of hair color to the bland color or the basic color, which would be that color we call gray. Okay, it's really a lack of that melanin pigmentation. What you can see is this would be the hair going in. Those sebaceous glands that we talk about surround the hair shaft. And we're going to look at some of these associated structures. So we're going to take a look at what goes on right here in terms of how the hair grows. Now there are some important reasons why we have hair. If we think about in terms of evolution, hair is actually quite important. Hair is important in maintaining warmth. Now in humans it's not the case so much anymore because we don't really have enough hair to keep us warm, though the hair on top of our head does help to keep our brain warm, which is important. What we find is that if you get chilly, you get goosebumps. That erector pili muscle that we have that causes goosebumps, it's standing your hair up on end. Now that doesn't do much for us, but if you imagine an animal with a lot more hair, like your cat or your dog, what they have is they have the ability when their hair stands up, it traps air. Their body heat warms that air and it acts like a dry suit. Right? If you've ever heard of somebody who goes dry suit diving, it's a layer of air that you warm up around you and that helps to keep you warm. Now another really interesting thing that hair does, if we flip back and look at this again, down here along the base of the hair, there is this hair plexus, this hair root nerve plexus. Right? This is where we're going to see the hair acting as a touch receptor. Now if you imagine sitting out on a warm summer evening, you may feel a mosquito landing on your skin. Okay? You are substantially larger than a mosquito. Okay? You cannot actually feel a mosquito landing on you. Its weight is negligible. What alerts you to the presence of that mosquito on your skin is that insect lands on you, and as it's moving around, it bumps into your hairs. And it causes tiny little vibrations in those hairs. And those tiny little vibrations are then transmitted as signals. Right? And that's what alerts you to the presence of bugs on your body. Now again, this might not be that important to us now, but in terms of evolutionary process, this was a really important thing. Right? This was a really important sensation, being able to know that there were insects crawling on your body. A third important function is to guard the scalp. The scalp is very important. We have a ton of blood flow to the scalp. If you've ever seen somebody who has a scalp lacerations bleed and bleed and bleed. Okay. It's also very important because the scalp surrounds the cranium. The cranium protects the brain. We will see that your scalp is actually going to help keep things cool. You do not want your brain overheating. Now, if anybody, this probably doesn't happen to guys so much, but it might happen to ladies. If you've ever decided to go to the beach and put your hair in like 2 little braids down the side, and you have a part that you don't normally have, and you go out in the sun and you get that massive sunburn on your scalp because you've moved the hair away from that. Right? Getting a sunburn on your scalp is really not fun because most of us have hair that covers our scalp, so our scalp usually doesn't see the light of day. Okay? It also is important in terms of preventing heat loss. I have hair, I have actually really pretty thick hair, and when I go out in the winter, I almost never wear a hat because my head gets warm just from my hair holding the heat in. So these are important functions of hair. Now, we as humans, we really don't have lots of hair over our bodies anymore. We've mentioned, with a few rare exceptions, most humans do not have hair everywhere. We have very fine hair. There are places where there is no hair whatsoever. This would be on the palms of the hands, soles of the feet, the lips, the nipples, and certain portions of the external genitalia have no hair. So even in instances where there are individuals who have genetic disorders and they are covered with their entire body with thick hair that you would see on the top of your head, they still do not have hair on their lips, nipples. So, I mean, you could take a look, right, and you will find small amounts of hair covering your body, but it's a really, really small amount for the most part, right? And we do see sex differences there, right? Males tend to have more body hair than females do, on their arms, on their chest. Now, in taking a look at where hair comes from, I mentioned that it is an in-pocketing of the epidermis. So if we look at this epidermal layer here, we see that the epidermal type cells fold in and they push down into the dermis, and that's where we see the hair growing from. So there are going to be these specialized cells down within here in the hair follicle. This is where the hair grows from. Right? Down over here, this is where the hair is going to be growing from. I mentioned the hair root plexus that wraps around. That's what allows it to act as a touch sensor. The deepest part is called the bulb. If you think about planting a plant, what you put in the ground of like a tulip, that's called the bulb. It's got that same kind of shape. Okay? And that's where the plant will grow from. Well, that's where the hair grows from as well. Now, if we take this in cross-section, okay, so we've taken a hair, we've cut it in cross-section, what we see is there's this outer connective tissue root sheath. Now remember, epidermis is epithelial tissue. Epithelial tissue always has to sit on connective tissue. So this outer layer of connective tissue is going to be supporting the epithelial tissue of the hair follicle. Then we have from the outer part of the wall moving inward, okay, we're going to have the cuticle. The cuticle is going to be a layer of cells. Okay. Then we'll have the medulla and surrounded by the cortex. So this, where I'm kind of highlighting with the mouse right over here, this is going to be where the actual hair will come out. Okay. What's called the glassy membrane and the external epithelial root sheath, that's going to support the growing hair. Now it's kind of hard for us to look at hair this way. Right? This would be like if you took a tree and cut it down and you're looking at the rings of the tree. Right? We tend to think about it more in cross-section. Now we're taking a look and we're cutting this so we can see how this is growing from the root. Okay, you did take a look at this in lab. Here we have what's called the hair papilla. Okay? This is all connective tissue. Lining this area here, we have the hair matrix. These are those cells that are going to rapidly divide. This is where your hair actually grows from. Dispersed in here, we're going to see melanocytes. Those melanocytes are what will give your hair its color. Below this, okay, these hair bulbs go so deep that they go so deep into the dermis, they're usually right at the border of the adipose tissue in the subcutaneous region. The cells that are in here are all going to be modified epidermal cells. What we'll see is they have a high degree of that keratinization, okay, and it's that hard keratin. That's what makes hair as strong as it is. Okay, hair is actually quite strong. When you hear about forensics tests and they do DNA on hair, what they are trying to get is hair that has the follicle and the bulb attached. Because if hair is pulled out and it contains the root, it will have living cells that the DNA is still accessible. If you were just to clip this little end, the dead ends of your hair, most of the cells at that point are dead and the DNA is not usable. So they're not useful in terms of doing DNA analysis or forensic analysis. In terms of having hair, right, there are differences obviously in things like texture of hair, thickness of hair, color of hair, right, and quantity of hair. There are some different disorders that lead to hair thinning and hair baldness. Okay. There are different forms of alopecia. Okay. Alopecia, there is a genetic form called alopecia universalis, which leads to there being no body hair at all, including eyebrows and eyelashes, which is actually quite problematic. There's something called alopecia areata, and this is more of a stress-induced alopecia where people lose their hair in patches. There are alopecia where it's just an overall thinning of the hair. Okay. And then there are true or frank baldness. Okay. These are genetically determined, and they're what's called sex-influenced conditions. Sex-influenced conditions mean that how the condition is displayed is determined by the hormonal state of the individual or the sex of the individual. Okay. One of these is male pattern baldness. Male pattern baldness is that very particular type of baldness that starts at the crown and works its way backwards, including a bald spot at the base of the head here, right here at the top. That male pattern baldness is caused by a follicular response to DHT. Okay, DHT is a type of androgen, right? It's a form of testosterone. So males that have high testosterone levels tend to, if they have the genetic predisposition to this male pattern baldness, tend to experience it earlier in life. Right? All right, so that finishes up hair. Let's move on to nails. When we talk about nails, nails are considered a scale-like modification of the epidermis, right? So we are seeing a change in the epidermal cells. Okay. We find these on the distal dorsal surface of the fingers and toes. Some of the important terminology here. Okay. The nail matrix, right, as with the hair matrix, the nail matrix is where we have the cells for actively dividing and actually creating the nail. Those lead into the root of the nail. This is where we have that growing nail. Where the fold occurs of the epidermis is called the proximal nail fold. And then we have this region called the eponychium. Okay, or the cuticle. This actually forms a nice little seal here, preventing bacteria and fungus from getting in and affecting the nail matrix and the nail root. If you get an infection in the matrix of your nail or the root of your nail, that is really, really difficult to treat. Okay. Now the body of the nail is this region over here, okay, that grows out on top of the nail bed. When you look at the nail, the body of the nail, it often looks like light pink color because you can actually see through into this very vascular connective tissue region right here. Okay. As this comes out, we have the free edge of the nail. We call that the hyponychium. Just to get your bearings, this would be if we cut through the distal phalanx, the bone and the tip of your finger. Now, nails, fingernails and toenails, are protective. Okay. In terms of evolution, they were important in a period in time when we needed to dig and fight and scratch. So anyways, all right. So let's just go over some of the general functions of the integumentary system. We've mentioned these throughout the lecture in terms of the different parts. The big thing of the integumentary system is protection. So we're protecting the body, the internal portions from chemical assaults, physical assaults. It acts as a mechanical barrier. Most disease prevention occurs through hand washing. We come into contact with germs all the time. Right now we are living in a society that is germ-phobic. How many of you have hand sanitizer in your bags right now? Probably a lot of you, right? Germs are not necessarily bad. You don't need to be slathering hand sanitizer on every 5 seconds. If you get germs on your hands and you wash your hands regularly, you're going to be fine. Okay. This is also the case for chemicals. Okay. Now, there are certain chemicals that can pass right through the epidermis, right through the dermis, get right into the blood supply. These are especially poisonous chemicals, things that are lipophilic. The things that are lipophilic, right, or hydrophobic, they can pass through the plasma membranes, so they can pass right through the cells. Zoom, 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 zoom. Okay. So those pesticides that you've heard of being so bad, okay, the reasons they're so bad is because most of those pesticides are these small lipophilic molecules. So if you get them on your skin doesn't act like a barrier. Whereas if you get something like bleach on your skin, right, bleach is pretty bad. If you drink bleach, you're a goner. But if you get bleach on your skin, you can wash that off. And in fact, if you get a blood spill, if any of you have taken like a bloodborne pathogen class, if you get a bad blood spill on your hands, you should actually wash your hands in water, soap, and then a light bleach solution, and then water, soap again. Another big thing dealing with the integumentary system has to do with regulation of body temperature. We mentioned how important homeostasis is. A big part of homeostasis is body temperature regulation. And we see this in terms of dilation and constriction of dermal vessels. Right? So within the dermis, we have blood vessels. When we need to cool the body off, we need to bring more blood to the surface. Right? Blood acts as a coolant in the body. That's why when you're hot, you're warm, you get flushed. You get that red look to your face, to your arms. Okay? That is your body trying to release heat. When you get cold, right, your body does the opposite. It constricts those blood vessels, keeps the blood at your core. We also see some of those accessory structures taking part in the cooling. Right? So the sweat gland secretions, we said that sweating, the goal of sweating really is to help cool the body down. We also have cutaneous sensation. Now this is extremely important. We will talk a little bit more about sensation in chapters 11, 12, and 13. But being able to feel your external environment is very important. If you don't have feeling in your hand, right, can you imagine that you could lean on a piece of glass and not know it? Right? You could lean on a hot stove and not know it. Right? When you have somebody who has neuropathies are when there's problems with the nerve sensations. This is really common in diabetics. Diabetics often get neuropathies, really bad ones in their feet. Right? So people who have diabetes are often, when they go in for their regular checkup, their regular diabetic checkup, the doctor has to take their socks and shoes off and examine their feet because they can have broken toes or they can have severe cuts or abrasions on their feet and not know it because they can't feel it. Okay? You can only respond to things that are going on in your external environment if you can sense them. All right. There are also a few other things. One of these is a metabolic function. Vitamin D is necessary for us to properly utilize calcium, to take calcium stored in the bones. We do get some amount of vitamin D from foods. Our body can produce vitamin D. The majority of vitamin D production actually occurs when you are exposed to the sun. Okay? And that allows for vitamin D synthesis to occur. The more skin you have exposed to the sun for longer periods of time, the more vitamin D you make, right? But we also live in a day and age where everyone's like afraid of skin cancer, which we'll talk about in a few minutes. So there are this kind of back and forth between the benefits of being in the sun, getting sun exposure to get vitamin D, and protecting yourself from the sun. Right? The other two things that we see in terms of functions in the integumentary system, a blood reservoir. If you've ever seen somebody with a scalp laceration, there is a huge amount of bleeding, a huge amount of blood vessels associated with the regions of the scalp, okay, the external areas. Sometimes the worst injuries don't bleed nearly as much as a very superficial injury. Okay? And then there is some small amount of excretion. There are small amounts of nitrogenous waste, which normally are removed through excretion through the urinary system. Small amounts are released then in the sweat and the skin. And that's like sometimes depending on what you've eaten throughout a day, right, your sweat may have a particular odor to it. So those are the different functions. Let's finish up just talking about a couple things that can go wrong. The book goes very in-depth in these. I'm just going to give an overview of skin cancer and an overview of burns. Now, in general, the term cancer is not well understood by most people. Cancer is simply a disorder in which cells go crazy. Right? Cells start dividing inappropriately. They start changing. They start growing where they shouldn't grow. Okay? That's really what cancer is. Skin cancer, then, is when you have cell changes that occur somewhere in the region of the skin. Most skin cancer tumors are benign. They do not metastasize. Metastasize is when the cancer cells change and move, and they can locate to another part of a body, and they can induce cancer in another part of a body. Okay. There is definitely a genetic risk to this. Right? Now we are in a genetic age, a molecular age, where we can actually screen people for certain genetic disorders and for predispositions. Okay? Just because you have a gene doesn't mean you will necessarily get a certain disorder, but you are much more likely to get it. Okay? A lot of the cancer that we see in skin cancer is due to UV radiation, due to exposure to the sun, due to genetics. Okay? And the reason this happens, it all has to do with how well DNA is able to fix itself. So the example of these skin lotions that can fix damaged DNA, These allow DNA that have undergone replication errors to bring themselves back to normal, to fix. Right? There's always errors made in DNA replication. It always happens. If we looked at every single cell in your body, some of your cells have errors. If the error occurs in a part that's not important, oh well, it's not important. If it occurs in an important part, it needs to be fixed, and we have those mechanisms. Right? We're not going to go into those. This isn't a genetics class. If it was, we'd spend a week or two looking at the different mechanisms. So we're going to look at 3 major types of skin cancer, right? And these are going to be named by the cells from which the cancer originates. Now, most of you have a desire to do something in the medical field, right? So this is going to be where you might have a bit more interest. The 3 main kinds are basal cell carcinoma, squamous cell carcinoma, and melanoma. Right, so keeping those names in mind, let's look at where these originate. Basal cell carcinoma is the least malignant and the most common of the skin cancers. These cancers originate as the layers of the stratum basale, which was that basal layer of the epidermis, become cancerous. These cells, remember, are supposed to divide and grow upward, feeding into the epidermis. Instead, they start dividing far too rapidly, and they invade downward into the dermis. And what you get is usually this kind of even swelling, because you have the tumor that's growing and it's pushing the epidermis up, and we have it growing within the dermis. Okay. For the most part, these grow very slowly and can usually be cured by surgical excision, so they can just be cut out without any real major follow-up. All right. The next kind are squamous cell carcinomas. These arise from those keratinocytes within the stratum spinosum. The stratum spinosum, that was the spiny or prickly layer. This is where we have those cells, those keratinocytes connected with desmosomes. When these become cancerous, remember, these cells are not supposed to divide anymore, right? Only cells in the stratum basale are supposed to divide. In the epidermis, if the stratum spinosum cells start to divide, they become cancerous. Okay. This often occurs in the regions of the head, the scalp, the ears, the lip. Okay. This can grow rapidly, so this is obviously on someone's scalp. Okay. If you take a look here, you can see this is on someone's scalp. This can grow rapidly, and it can become metastatic. However, this does respond to both surgical removal, if caught early enough, and radiation. Now, the last type is the worst type of cancers that we're going to mention. This is called melanoma. This melanoma originates from the melanocytes, which we would have seen throughout the stratum basale as well, but these are the melanocytes. Remember, melanocytes produce melanin. This is very clear to see because the area affected will have an area of massive discoloration. Okay. Pretty large. This is much larger than what you would see as a common sunspot. This is actually the big toe. Strangely enough, the toes are a pretty common place for melanoma to occur. This is highly metastatic, so these can spread quite quickly. It's also very resistant to chemotherapy. So melanoma is the worst of the skin cancers that we'll mention. Okay. Now, if you take a look at this area, this is a very clear melanoma. Okay. If we look at it, there are these rules to knowing whether or not a melanoma could be problematic. It's called the ABCD rule. And of course, now you're all going to go home tonight, look at yourselves in the mirror, and diagnose yourself with something. If you have an area that is asymmetrical, so if you try to divide it in 2 even halves, you can't because it's got a funny shape. Okay. If the border of it is bumpy rather than being smooth like a circle, if it has a very deep coloration, black, brown, tan, and sometimes even blue, okay, that blue coloration is another way melanin appears depending on the individual. And if it has a diameter bigger than 6 millimeters, which is just a little over half a centimeter, okay, those are things that are problematic. So if you see those, if you have a darkened area of your skin, and not something you've had your entire life, right? You can have a birthmark that has all of these, but you've had it ever since you were born. That is not melanoma, right? That's a birthmark. So then we're going to talk about burns just very quickly. We're going to talk about 3 degrees of burns. The first is called a first-degree burn. Here we have a burn that's only going into the epidermis. Here we have localized swelling, redness, pain. So this is only burning those top layers of the epidermis, that epithelial tissue layer. This would be like a sunburn. Okay. Sunburn is a classic first-degree burn. It hurts, it's red, it's swollen. It's usually fine within a day or two. Second degree burn, you burn through the epidermis, and you actually burn some of the regions of the dermis, just the upper region of the dermis. Okay. Here's where you may see blistering. This is very common with steam burns and hot water burns. I used to make jellies, and with jelly you basically superheat sugar, and I was pouring jelly into a jar, and it got slightly distracted and poured hot jelly down my arm. Okay, it got really nasty second-degree burns, blistering. Okay. Here you have usually a high degree of pain. You have that blistering. Takes longer to heal. Then you have a third-degree burn. Third-degree burn burns through the thickness of the skin, so it burns all the way through the epidermis, dermis, down into the hypodermis. Okay. This is where you have the area that has been burned, looks gray-white, bright red, black. It actually can look like blackened flesh if you think about like cooking a chicken breast on the grill. That blackened look, you can actually see that. Usually at the beginning there's no pain and no swelling with a third-degree burn. And the reason for that is you have burned all the way through the layers of the integumentary system where you would have the pain receptors and where you would have the interstitial tissues to create the fluid. Third-degree burns are really problematic. Small third-degree burn can eventually heal. It may lead to severe scarring, though. If it's large enough, it might need a skin graft because that area of skin may just be gone. You might need skin grafting. Third-degree burns that occur over large portions of the body basically open the body up to infection. So in terms of people who are caught in things like house fires, usually what somebody dies of, if they don't die of smoke inhalation, if they survive the fire and have severe burns, the first thing has to do with a massive lack of they get massively dehydrated very quickly because their body can't hold the fluid anymore because your skin helps to keep fluid in your body. Then the second thing is massive infection. Right? Without having a good protection from your integument, right, you're very prone to infection. Right? Most of us hopefully have not experienced third-degree burns. If they have been, they're very small.